Cool. Hello, welcome to the 9th session of the Nāgārjuna Karika study group. And we are reading chapters 15 and 16, analysis of intrinsic nature and analysis of bondage and liberation. Cool. So let's start with 15. And I think the first paragraph of the commentary is very informative. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. According to Abhidharma, to be ultimately real is to have an intrinsic nature, svabhava. Something is ultimately real just to the extent that its being what it is does not depend on the nature of other things. The test for something's having intrinsic nature is to see if it retains this nature after being either divided up or analyzed. Thus, the chariot is not ultimately real precisely because its nature is not to be found among its parts. In this chapter, Nāgārjuna will argue that anything originating in dependence on causes and conditions must lack intrinsic nature and thus be empty. Since most Buddhists believe that all things originate in dependence on causes and conditions, this is tantamount to an argument for the claim that all things that are accepted as real by Buddhists are empty. So this is a really cool chapter because it seems like a lot of the concern in Madhyamaka analysis seems to revolve precisely around this idea of intrinsic nature as svabhava. It's sort of like the sort of underlying ground or assumption that generates a lot of the other problems that we've been investigating in the other chapters. So it seems like a really crucial chapter and point of discussion here. Cool. And what the commentary also says is that part of the aim of this chapter is also, or one of the aims that we can sort of see in this chapter is that Nāgārjuna is also trying to show how the Madhyamaka analysis of emptiness is not a nihilism. And that will follow from some of the reasoning that we're going to look at. Cool. So I'll start with verse 1. It is not correct to say that intrinsic nature is produced by means of causes and conditions. An intrinsic nature that was produced by causes and conditions would be a product. So the commentary here gives two different readings of this verse, one by Chandrakirti and one by Buddhapalita, which is interesting because they take two different approaches of how we can analyze something in terms of its parts. So Chandrakirti sort of explains it in a kind of causal relationship of production. And Buddhapalita gives a kind of analysis based on the relationships between wholes and parts. So let's see. So I guess from the Chandrakirti sort of causal explanation of the argument, it sort of goes where the intrinsic nature is kind of already in the causes and conditions, then the production of that phenomena with that intrinsic nature would be superfluous because it's sort of already in the causes and conditions. So I'll read a bit of the commentary. The intrinsic nature of a newly arisen thing cannot have already been in the causes and conditions that produce that thing. For if it were, that production of that thing would have been pointless. So part of the implication of this is that the intrinsic nature would also have to be produced alongside with the production of that phenomena, and because it doesn't make sense for it to be just in the causes and conditions. And so, but we'll analyze that next point in the next verse. Buddhapalita's interpretation is that the intrinsic nature of a whole can't be found in its parts because that ends up making intrinsic nature into an external nature. So rather than having the whole intrinsically endowed with a quality or property, if we explain that intrinsic nature by reference to the parts that compose the whole, then we're not really talking about an intrinsic nature, we're talking about an extrinsic nature. So these are two different ways of explaining why it is not correct to say that intrinsic nature is produced by means of causes and conditions. So the next verse sort of analyzes the alternative that's sort of implied by Chandrakirti's analysis, that intrinsic nature is produced along with the phenomena being produced. And that doesn't make sense either. So we'll read the verse. 2. But how could there ever be an intrinsic nature that is a product? for intrinsic nature is not adventitious, nor is it dependent on something else. So, so in the first verse, we see that intrinsic nature can't be already in the causes and conditions of phenomena. So we might say, okay, it's produced alongside the phenomenon. But then verse 2 says that that doesn't make sense. And I guess part of the reasoning is that that what the commentary says is that intrinsic natures being a product is that the problem with an intrinsic natures being a product is that the two things are mutually contradictory. So for something to be intrinsic, it has to be unproduced, because if it's produced, it's dependent on something else, and such it won't be intrinsic. So it doesn't make sense for us to claim something's has an intrinsic nature while also being produced, or the intrinsic nature also being produced. Another aspect of intrinsic natures is being sort of self-existent. So if it can only exist by relation to something else, again, we sort of annihilate the very thing we're trying to establish here, which is intrinsic nature.
Right, and I think the commentary on this is interesting because it points out something which I think is a good objection, which is that, well, we might say it doesn't necessarily seem for intrinsic as opposed to adventitious properties that these properties need to be explained with reference to additional causes and conditions, but rather it could just be that, they are the product of the same causes and conditions. But then the commentary also explains that the response to this is under the view that, say, something like fire is the bearer of heat, then its heat, since it's the bearer, must be something that exists independently of fire, and thus we must explain the causes and conditions in virtue of which fire bears this property of being hot. At which point we would say, well, then that's not actually its intrinsic nature, because we have some explanation, we have some analysis, that is, of in virtue of what it is true that it is hot. Of course, though, then as Sideritz and Katsura explained, though, later Abhidharmikas take a position which is resistant to this argument, which is to simply identify a dharma with its nature rather than to say it's a bearer of its nature. In other words, a trope theory. But I actually think, and it's interesting that there's another place, which is in the analysis of the dhatus, where you could also use a trope theory to escape Nāgārjuna's objection. And neither here nor in that chapter does Nāgārjuna try and respond to this proposal that maybe a dharma just is its nature. Perhaps, as they say, this might not have been a widely held view by anyone until well after Nāgārjuna. Apparently, they mention, though, that Chandrakirti does attempt to respond to this in some way, this view of maybe a dharma is simply its intrinsic nature. But I actually think there's a really interesting objection Sideritz has proposed to say why, even if you propose a trope theory, which is just that it's not clear how you could, if dharmas simply are their intrinsic nature, it's not clear how you could individuate and explain what the difference is between two dharmas in an intrinsic fashion. You'd always have to be making reference to some other dharma in order to say this is this particular dharma and not that one. All individuation, in other words, would require going in these circles of, well, these two are different from one another because of their different relationships to this, and that one is different from other things because of its different relationships to this, and so on. And you end up getting, even if you think, therefore, that these dharmas that are identical with their intrinsic natures escape the issue of having to explain why that nature is not then dependently originated, you still have a dependent origination of that nature being an individual particular dharma, which then is a problem that Sideritz thinks ends up posing a problem for the trope theorist Abhidharmika, even if Nāgārjuna himself doesn't make this response, because apparently that was just not a thing that people proposed.
So if I'm following correctly, it's a kind of like this trope dharma to even identify its characteristics or what it is distinct from another trope. You sort of keep deferring the explanation to other tropes.
Yes,
But there's never a point where you can, it's very similar to kind of like an infinite regress issue. It's like there's never a point where you can actually identify intrinsically the thing without reference to something else that would somehow end the sequence of deferrals.
And unlike, say, like a causal regress, which is non-vicious because each thing is explained, here this regress is, I think, vicious because if this thing's, because unlike with the causal regress, where a thing's being explained by the existence of something else just requires that that exists, but it doesn't require that that exist in a fashion that's not also causally produced. Unlike in that case, I think with the case of individuation, if you're making reference to some other things in order to explain why this is an individual thing, and those other things are not themselves explained in a similar fashion, then it seems like maybe you haven't actually explained anything because you could just well ask, because it still leaves open the possibility that actually you haven't done any individuation at all, right?
Right. It seems like in order to do the individuation, you need to reference something else, but in order to meaningfully reference something else, you would have to already individuated the thing that
exactly
you're doing.
Right. You'd have to have individuated that thing, which means you need the explanation for that. But then you'd have to go and look at something else too. But in order to even make that jump, that other thing has to be individuated already. You need the explanation for its individuation in order for it to provide any explanatory force at all. It does actually defer. Individuation is infinitely deferred.
Right. Interesting. Can you quickly elaborate a little bit on trope theory? It sounds interesting. I haven't encountered it too much.
Trope theory
almost sounds like it's something that's like both a particular and a universal.
So that's basically what trope theories are. Ontological theories in which the existence of like properties as universals which inhere into individuals is denied, and instead it's held that instead of there being individuals and properties that characterize individuals, there's just properties, and the properties are property particulars. So rather than there being like a like water that is hot, there's like an occurrence of heat that's like next to an occurrence of wetness or something, and this is how they would frame it.
I can see how it would be attractive to people to make that connection with Dharma theory. It does seem like very similar.
Yeah, and so then certain later Abhidharmikas basically made this exact move, saying, I think actually Vasubandhu maybe seems to think this. So that's like 3 centuries after Nāgārjuna, which is that like dharmas simply are the property that is their intrinsic nature. They're not an individual that bears that property. So a heat, like a fire atom isn't, following the like atomism. A fire atom isn't some individual that bears heat as a property. It just is an occurrence of heat. Anyway, Sidoritz's, I just resent it to the chat. I had sent it before, but I just sent again to the Facebook chat, Mark Sidoritz's explanation of this individuation problem for trope theory, which he says, could be appended to Nāgārjuna's argument to make it resistant to trope theory.
Cool. I'm going to just share the screen for a second, so anyone watching can pause the video and look at that. Cool.
So it starts from, but there is a problem with this view. That's where, can you share it again, actually?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but there's a problem with this view. Suppose there are 3 earth atoms where the earth atoms are just merely occurrences of solidity, right? Because that's what the trope theory would suggest, is earth atom really just means occurrence of the solidity trope. Whatever individuates, and then space atoms, right? Because we're following Abhidharma, which thinks space is like a kind of thing. Space atoms are just non-solidity, non-resistance tropes. So you have in, some solidity tropes and some non-solidity, some non-resistance tropes. In order to distinguish two different non-solidity tropes, the most intuitive way to do it would be to say, well, they're in different places. But being in different places is something you're going to be saying so with reference to what tropes are around them. Which means then you'd have to say, well, then how do I know what the individual identity of the tropes around them are? And that's also with reference to where they are. And so you just end up going in these circles and you never get to an explanation of how you can tell the difference between two different occurrences of solidity.
And you said this is from Sideritz, right?
Yeah. There is an option, though, that one could take, which is that some contemporary trope theorists take, which is to just say, the individuality of tropes is primitive.
Interesting.
I don't really exactly know what this means, honestly.
So it's almost like okay, we can see the points, but we can't know its properties yet, or its quality. Is that kind of it? Like the individual.
It's just to say that tropes being individuals is just a primitive property that they have. There is no need to explain it. You can just say, This trope is this trope. That's what it means, that it's not that trope, because it's this one and that one is that one. And it's not because it's in this place or that one's in that place. They're just primitively different. They're not, there's no need to explain their difference. And
I find it's complicated, but it sounds like a cop-out.
It does sound like a cop-out to me as well, yeah.
Cool.
But I don't know. I'm sure it is complicated. It's probably more complicated than just making a cop-out. But at first glance, it does seem like perhaps it's just
maybe we'll have to work through it, and then eventually we'll come out to a more sophisticated way of saying it's a cop-out.
Maybe.
Cool. So let's keep going with the text. 3. So 3 is cool. Very simple, but I think really interesting. Given the non-existence of intrinsic nature, svabhava, how will there be extrinsic nature, parabhava? For extrinsic nature is said to be the intrinsic nature of another existent, parabhava. So I feel like that's kind of a little self-explanatory. Intrinsic nature, we can kind of say that intrinsic nature and extrinsic nature are sort of mutually entailing. If you want to know what the intrinsic nature of one thing is, you kind of have to differentiate it from something else. And to be able to do that, you need to know what the intrinsic nature of something else is. And this sort of makes me think of also a kind of argument, which I don't know if I think I picked it up from somewhere, but it's also something I sort of understand. So the relationship between difference in identity, in the sense that to say that two things are different, you kind of have to already know that the things you're saying are different are identical to themselves. So you kind of can't have an idea of pure difference, right? Because you always have to. So if A is other than B, to meaningfully make that claim, you kind of have to understand what A already is, and that A equals A. And I think how this relates to this is, if we can sort of go with the example that's provided in the commentary, in order to say that heat is the extrinsic nature of water, we need to first establish what water is, what the intrinsic nature of water is. So in this way, we can understand that intrinsic natures and extrinsic natures are sort of mutually entailing concepts. And so if you can't have intrinsic nature, you can't have extrinsic nature either. You can't make this I feel like no one actually makes this argument, but I feel like you can make a very simple mistake by thinking that, okay, so there's nothing that's intrinsically existent. Everything is extrinsically existent. Everything borrows its nature from something else. But in order for you to do that, the thing itself has to have some kind of intrinsic nature of its own. for you to even identify it as having this extrinsic relationship. So we're not allowed to make that move. We're not allowed to make that opposite move.
I actually think this maybe relates to something Westerhoff talks about, which is that even if it's not nihilism in the sense that Buddhists are critiquing when they talk about nihilism, and even if it's not nihilism in the contradictory sense of saying that things don't exist, including this very statement that things don't exist, right? Even if it's not nihilism in the contradictory sense, there is a sense in which Madhyamaka is a kind of nihilism, because in saying that each individual thing in lacking an intrinsic nature is analyzable to other things, but that those, and thus is unreal, but that those are likewise analyzable, and thus, even if you don't end with a kind of contradictory metaphysical nihilism, whenever you, with like say Madhyamaka vision, if you had Madhyamaka goggles, whenever you look at anything, you find it to be unreal. And that is there is a kind of nihilism in that, perhaps.
Yeah.
But not contradictory nihilism, I suppose.
Has anyone made a Madhyamaka-based meme of the glasses that tell you the truth from that movie?
That would be funny. Yeah, you put on the glasses and then there's just like there just isn't anything there.
Right.
You just have the like the gray and white spots that image editors put when you remove when you delete an image.
Yeah.
It's just that.
No, I like that, not black, but like the sort of checkerboard void in like Photoshop.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was imagining. Emptiness goggles.
Yeah, let's make that meme.
Yeah.
Cool. So as we continue, so verse 4 kind of elaborates a little bit, still on the same point. Further, without intrinsic nature and extrinsic nature, how can there be an existent bhava? For an existence is established given the existence of either intrinsic nature or extrinsic nature. So this is cool. So it seems the implications of there not being intrinsic natures is that there's no extrinsic natures, because the two concepts are mutually entailing. But then if there's neither intrinsic or extrinsic natures, how can we ground anything at all? Because for something to be a thing, we would have to say that it has either an intrinsic nature of its own or a nature that it borrows from something else. And then I think verse 5 is key to understanding why Madhyamaka may appear as a nihilism in a meaningful sense, but ultimately isn't a nihilism. And before I read that verse, the point you made about how Madhyamaka does seem like a nihilism, which I agree with, it seems like, I think we can say that from the perspective of the sort of eternalists that we're critiquing, from their perspective, as far as they are concerned, Madhyamaka is a nihilism. Because we completely denied the conditions of existence that the eternalist accepts. So, and assuming that, most people have some kind of predilection towards eternalism, it would seem like for most people, which makes sense in terms of how Buddhism in general was early received by Western Buddhologists as a form of nihilism. Because
this is actually a strategically perhaps even a good thing.
I think Westerhoff has made that point.
Exactly. He was like
the kind of like a tactical nihilism approach.
If you're driving too far to the right, to get to the middle, you have to drive to the left.
Right.
Similarly, if you're in a milieu that is too realist, you have to make nihilistic moves to get to the right place. If you're in a milieu that's too contradictorily nihilist, you have to make the right moves to get to the place that is not like contradictory annihilationist nihilism. And Westerhoff says this because he's like the current philosophical milieu that a present day Madhyamaka would find themselves in is broadly a realist naturalist one.
Right.
So if you want to move away from that towards the correct position, you have to make some nihilism-y moves, because or things that will seem that will at least seem like nihilist moves from the predominant perspective of naturalist realism.
Yeah, see, I think there's something tricky there that I feel like we have to be really careful about, like, because like the way I see it is like, and I guess I question the extent of the efficacy of that kind of skillful means, we can say, not to undermine using it at all, but just to sort of think about its limits. Because if you take a kind of dialectical view on the relationship between eternalism and nihilism, if you sort of see that how, being extremes that are actually genetically originating from a kind of baseline assumption or baseline point of view, it could be that, opposing someone with the other extreme, instead of actually getting them to the middle, it might actually make them go further to the opposite extreme because of the way opposites sort of work, through their differentiation from each other. So in order to do that, in order to do that successfully and actually bringing them to the middle, we have to do that thing where okay, we appear nihilistic from the terms accepted by the eternalist, but we're not actually nihilist. Because if we were being actually nihilist, it's kind of like the very thing that the eternalist is kind of defining themselves against. So they will just there's a risk of them even going more extreme. So I don't know, but do you get what I mean by there? It's like that. I feel like it just really depends on how we do it, because I guess like Buddhism Madhyamaka does avoid the two extremes, but even in so doing that, it still appears as a nihilism, kind of undeniably, which is interesting.
This argument that you, Sagar, mentioned, that there is, in a way, not enough nihilism nowadays.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Adorno's similar argument in the negative dialectics. It's the book that I read many years ago. Of course, when I was still a student, of course, I don't remember the exact words or anything else, but I think it was in the last chapter of that book, which has a title, I think something like Solidarity with Metaphysics in the Time of its Decline, or something like that. And when he talks about nihilism, he says something like that if anything, there's not enough nihilism.
Yeah, I haven't read negative dialectics, but it does seem like I can see how the point sometimes could be like, from a sort of, if we're undertaking some kind of dialectical analysis, there's sometimes this sort of this urge or tendency to try to use the negative movement of the dialectic only to synthesize something at the end. And I can see how Adorno and the sort of Marxian angle is to sort of keep with the negative movement of the dialectic and sort of, resist that urge to synthesize at the end. That, I guess, that would be sort of the Hegelian move. And even still Marxists, still have that sometimes, this urge to create this synthetic ideas and proposals from their analyses. So yeah, that's interesting. I think the one relevant book is Benjamin Noy's Persistence of the Negative. And that's a really cool text on the continental side, sort of analyzing a lot of major continental thinkers of the recent last decades, like Derrida, Deleuze, Badiou, Zizek, I think, and points out all of these different authors are sort of like, can be characterized a little bit as part of this sort of more maybe antinomian trend within Western thought, that it sort of affirms difference and negativity in some way, only to somehow sneak in some kind of positive account of being reality or whatever they're investigating in the end. So and Benjamin Noy is also, basically the point is that even when people are trying to work with the negative, they still somehow end up bringing some positive element back in. So it does seem like there's, yeah, like no one wants to go through with the full implications of negativity. And I guess perhaps following Westerhoff's program, that's the task of Madhyamika, is to persist with the negative in that tactical manner. Cool, so if we can go back to the text now. Oh yeah, so verse 5, that's where we're in. I was pointing out how I think verse 5 is key to understanding the point why Madhyamika, though it appears as nihilism, is not actually nihilism. So if the existent is unestablished, then the non-existent, abhava, too is not established. For people proclaim the non-existence to be the alteration of the existent. So the argument here seems to be that if we can't establish things to be existent because we can't establish inherent or extrinsic natures, intrinsic or extrinsic natures, then we can't establish non-existence either. Because just as intrinsic natures and extrinsic natures mutually entail each other, so does existence and non-existence. So we can't establish existence, we can't establish non-existence either. So I think this is part of the reason why Madhyamika is not a nihilism, because it's not saying because things do not ultimately exist, therefore it's not saying like because things do not exist ultimately, that they do not exist ultimately. That's not the point that's being made. If anything, we can kind of say that things neither exist ultimately nor ultimately non-existent. So it's this sort of double negation here, or I guess since that's already a kind of term with its own definitions and dialectics, we can say it's a bi-negation, which is a term that I think Melvin Sprigg and Peter Paul Keckle used to describe Madhyamika reasoning, that it often amounts to a bi-negation. So it's not just a negation of ultimately real things, it's also a negation of the negation of ultimately real things. So it's neither, things do not exist or not exist. So that sort of saves, this should save the Madhyamika from the charge of metaphysical nihilism. So a little bit from the commentary. For it to be ultimately true that all is non-existent, it must at least be possible for there to be ultimate existence. But that requires that we be able to make sense of intrinsic nature. The argument of this chapter so far has been that we cannot do that on terms accessible to the Buddhist. So yeah, that's actually an interesting point I didn't touch on, is that if we can't even make sense of existence, right, we can't make sense of non-existence either, because non-existence is merely the absence of existence. Cool. So verse 6 and 7, they're both sort of, we can both combine them a little. 6, intrinsic nature and extrinsic nature, existent and non-existent, who see these do not see the truth of the Buddhist teachings. 7, in the instructing of Katyayana, both it exists and it does not exist are denied by the Blessed One, who clearly perceives the existent and the non-existent. And it seems like the function of these verses is sort of for Nāgārjuna to ground a lot of his logical arguments on a scriptural basis, to show that these arguments are not only sound and coherent, but they actually are derived from, extended from, or accords with the Buddhist teachings. And the commentary has a lot of interesting things to say about this, particularly with the point that Chandrakirti makes about the middle way. So, and this is something that I think is actually really, I feel like there's an issue here that I think a lot of people, myself a little bit included, when first encountering the Madhyamika can make a mistake of, is to actually take the middleness too seriously. The idea that the middle actually means a kind of like, so I'll read the commentary. The Madhyamika middle path is not a moderate or compromised position, lying on the same continuum as the two extremes. Instead, it must involve rejecting some underlying presupposition that generates the entire continuum. And I think that's really key point to understand how I think that's another way to say how Madhyamaka doesn't have a view, right? Because it's not a middle view in between two extreme views. It's sort of a kind of interrogation of the entire structure that generates views in the first place. And there's a cool quote by Chandrakirti quoting the Samadhiraja Sutra. And I'll quote, "It exists and it does not exist are both extremes. Pure and impure are both extremes. The wise man, avoiding both extremes, likewise does not take a stand in the middle." And this seems to be this not only is this in Chandrakirti, but also in a sutra, which obviously predates Chandrakirti. But even then, it seems like some Buddhists sometimes have a hard time with this point or accidentally make the kind of point. I think from what I might be like sort of butchering this, but I was reading a little bit on Mipam's view on the middle way by something that Douglas Duckworth wrote about how there's ways in which Mipam's critique of sort of some of the Gilut views in the idea that that ultimately the lack of intrinsic nature is sort of the point at which we end at. Mipam's point is kind of like that sort of takes the middle too literally as a kind of point of view to take up. And so instead, Mipam sort of like emphasizes this idea of a non-abiding middle. So we don't actually stand on a place, we don't abide in a middle. It's sort of a non-abiding middle. It's like it's not a middle that we actually take a stand on, but it would be more like a kind of operation we take on.
So this reminds me, there's an amazing Pure Land Sutra. It's called the Mayopama Samadhi Sutra. Well, that's what it's called in the Tibetan translation. No Sanskrit survives for it. In the Chinese one, it's called, I think, the Sutra of the Prophecy of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva is what I think it's called. And it's a Pure Land Sutra in that it relates to the three Pure Land sages, Amitabha, Avalokiteshvara, and Mahaprasthata. What the heck is his name? The Bodhisattva who's on the left of Amitabha, Mahastama Prapta. Mahastama Prapta. That's what he's called.
What's Samaprata mean? Because Maha is great.
Right. Mahastama Prapta. Stama, I think it's the verbal root, which means to stand, I would guess. And then Prapta, yeah, so that is right. Stama is strength, power. That makes sense. Often associated with Bala, Virya, Tibetan is Tu. That makes sense because the Pure Land prayer goes Ngotsar Sanje Nangotayadang Yesu Jo Tuje Chenpodang Yundu Zempa Tuche Tobnam La Yundu Zempa Tuche Tobnam La Bodhisattva of great power. That's this Tu that is the same as Tama. So I guess it means great, powerful, the one arrived at great power, because Prapta means to arrive at or to obtain. So the great, or maybe the one maybe it's Mahastama Prapta, not Mahastama Prapta. So it's the having obtained great power. Having obtained great power. That's probably what it means. Yeah. So this sutra is a Pure Land Sutra because it's about these three, and specifically it talks about how Avalokiteshvara and Mahastama Prapta are the bodhisattvas who have the greatest mastery of a particular samadhi called the Mayopama samadhi, the illusion-like samadhi. And all the other celestial bodhisattvas learned this by learning it from them. Like Maitreya visited the Pure Land and learned it from them and so on. And this samadhi is the one that allows celestial bodhisattvas to emanate myriad bodies into the different realms of existence. They enter this samadhi, and then in doing so are able to emanate these realms. And Avalokiteshvara and Mahastama Prapta are, according to this sutra, the best bodhisattvas at doing this. And when the Buddha says what is actually entailed or how it is that one reaches this samadhi, he says, he doesn't actually give an explanation for how to enter it. He just says, those who master not abiding anywhere will naturally obtain mastery in this samadhi.
Oh.
Where this samadhi is the one that's connected with the ability to emanate one's body anywhere, as Avalokiteshvara and Mahastama Prapta do. That's what this idea, this Mipam idea of like a non-abiding middle, not abiding anywhere, kind of reminded me of. Is this sutra where the Buddha talks about this being the precondition for emanating into any of the realms of existence so as to help beings everywhere, is to not abide anywhere. It's kind of an interesting little turn of phrase.
I feel like those two things definitely resonate with each other.
Yeah.
You know, they're definitely accord with each other. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. It also, just like, I don't know if you're interested in Pure Land stuff or whatever, but
yes, any Buddhist stuff.
It's interesting because one of the main kind of Pure Land religious experiences that people talk about reference to the Pure Land is people near the time of death having visions of Avalokiteshvara and Mahastama Prapta, bringing them to the Pure Land. And the fact is that because of how many Pure Land Buddhists there are, and like within that, how many reports of this experience there are way more people reporting visions of seeing Avalokiteshvara or Mahastama Prapta than of, say, seeing Maitreya or Manjushri or whatever. Right. Which then again goes to the Buddha saying, yeah, they are the two bodhisattvas who are best at emanating into whatever realms. And you go and look empirically, the number of people who claim to have seen Avalokiteshvara and Mahastama Prapta is much higher than for any other celestial bodhisattva. Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting connection there. I don't know.
And I've noticed in the Tibetan tradition, it seems like Manjushri pops up everywhere.
Well, even when not that many people have Manjushri visions compared to Avalokiteshvara visions, right? Right? Like
Chenrezig.
Yeah, Chenrezig. I mean,
I can see that. Maybe I'm just highlighting that recently. Every time I read something, it's like so-and-so's emanation of Manjushri, so-and-so derived inspiration from a vision of Manjushri.
Right, true. Tsongkhapa famously had a vision of Manjushri.
Did Mipam?
You know, I'm not sure. I know he reported himself, or no, he didn't report it. He in his biography, the one that Janyang Chense Wangpo wrote of him. No, I don't actually remember who wrote this biography. The like very famous one that was recently translated under the title Lion of Speech. It did say that he had a vision of Sakya Pandita, which I thought was pretty interesting. And that it was this vision that caused him to understand Dharmakirti. Like he was saying, like what it says in the biography is Mipam was having a very hard time understanding the Pramana Vartika, and he like was studying it very late in the night, and then he went to sleep. And then he had a vision of Sakya Pandita, in which Sakya Pandita was there holding the book Pramana Vartika and was like, you can't understand this, really? It's so simple. And then the next day, he was like, oh, I got it.
Awesome.
So that's what I remember of Mipam having visions.
Wow. See, these freaking Tibetan masters, they, found ways to keep learning and dreaming. That's awesome.
Exactly.
I need some of that.
Yeah, dream tutor Sakya Pandita berating you in a compassionate fashion.
Yeah, if I could use all those extra 8 hours per day still studying, that'd be great. Let's see. Okay, where are we now? Okay, 8. So if something existed by essential nature, prakriti, then there would not be the non-existent existence of such a thing. For it never holds that there is the alteration of essential nature. So, let's see. Oh, whoops, I skipped ahead in my notes for a second. Okay, so I'll read that again. If something existed by essential nature, then there would not be the non-existence of such a thing. And that's interesting. Oh, and for it never holds that there is the alteration of essential nature. And I'll read the next verse because I think it's related. Objection. So the interlocutor says, if essential nature did not exist, of what would there be the fact of alteration? And Nāgārjuna's reply would be, if essential nature did exist, of what would there be the fact of alteration? I always find these verses kind of funny. There's like a couple of them where as a retort, you say the exact same thing your opponent said.
You're right.
Yeah. And the way so the two things I kind of got from 8 and 9 is that 8 is saying that if something has an intrinsic nature, essential nature, then it can never stop doing that thing. So it can never actually disappear. And verse 9 says, it basically implies that if intrinsic nature cannot ever change. So there's no change. And so there's some interesting things happening here. On one side, there's like, well, this is sort of proof that the intrinsic nature sort of contradicts impermanence, right? Because for there to be impermanence and momentariness, there are things that arise and perish, and also there are things that change and alter. But it seems to imply that intrinsic nature precludes anything, or at least that thing, from stopping or changing. But then that gets to my next point, that it kind of does preclude, so the intrinsic nature of one thing not only precludes its own stopping and changing, but kind of gets in the way of everything else. And this is something I've noticed with my studies in Madhyamaka, that there's something about an intrinsic nature, that if you have the intrinsic nature of even one insignificant thing, the implications are so massive that it just sort of obstructs anything else. You know, it's kind of like it almost takes up all the room that anything else can have. You know, because like it sort of both temporally and spatially, it sort of obstructs anything else from happening or moving. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right. Do you get a sense of that? It's sort of like if we allow anything in our sort of system of thought to have an intrinsic nature, its negative implications kind of bleed out to the entire system. So it creates like it sort of ends up making us, it sort of creates malfunctions for any procedure that we try to operate with, just by having it there. It sort of takes up room that could be taken up by other things which do change and which do perish.
Interesting, yeah. And I guess then this even extends outside of the realm of just like non-abstract things into the realm of abstract things too, like which is why you could have like Madhyamika approaches to, say, epistemology, where something like perception in the abstract and what certifies perception's epistemic capacity in the abstract also kind of can get poisoned by the introduction of svabhava view holding.
Right. Yeah, poison is a good term. It's sort of this infection that happens to your system.
Yeah.
When you allow it to sort of operate. And that's kind of what I mean. It's sort of not just a problem in itself, but it causes more problems for anything else that, you know, it's sort of in relation with, or precisely because it can't be in relation with anything. It's sort of an obstruction there. I mean, that's almost the same language, right? I mean, the assumption of intrinsic nature is an obstruction to omniscience, to clear seeing. Cool. So verse 10 and 11, we can read those two together. It exists as an eternalist view. It does not exist as an annihilationist idea. Therefore, the wise one should not have recourse to either existence or non-existence. For whatever exists by its intrinsic nature does not become non-existent. Eternalism then follows. It does not exist now, but it existed previously. From this, annihilation follows. So just sort of reiterating that the point of the Buddhist teachings is this middle path beyond the two extremes. I'm curious about the slight distinction in the translation, eternalist view and annihilationist idea. Is there anything significant about that? Maybe if you look in the Sanskrit, what's the two different terms being used?
Let me see.
And I don't actually see where's the drishti view? I don't see that in the Sanskrit.
So astiti shasvata graho nasti yucheda darshanam. So is it this? The graha. Oh, Sashvata Graha. So I know darshanam is what's being translated here as idea.
I see.
Doesn't
it also kind of mean philosophy or something?
Yeah, it does.
Actually,
he doesn't actually use the word view here. This first line says it exists is adherence to eternity. Shasvata graha. Shasvata is eternal, and then graha is like holding to, is like holding. Laying hold of is graha. So what it literally said is it exists is laying hold to eternalism. And then nastiti, it does not exist, is an annihilationist ucheda philosophy or idea, darshanam.
Okay, that actually makes sense to me now, because it does seem like, especially if you take a kind of psychological view, it does seem that our more innate, loose term innate here, our more innate issue, our own innate ignorance is more on the eternalist side, that we take things, the things that we see, we take them to actually really exist. And it does seem like the annihilationist view
is more of like a philosophical posit, as opposed to being the fundamental ignorance.
Because you don't see nothing. you just it's sort of the skeptical idea. I guess it's like someone notices the issues with taking things as they are, but instead of taking the Buddhist route, they sort of take a more philosophical, skeptical approach, which is still an idea.
So ucheda is a darshanam, but the normal eternalist state of grasping is just like a cognitive default. Maybe that's another reason for the tactical upaya of going in a kind of nihilistic way, at least maybe with respect to like how you teach in a dharma setting versus, I don't know if you would do the same thing in like an academic setting, but maybe it's more important, and maybe this could even be related to why in, say, like in the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, it talks about how emptiness gets taught originally and then how emptiness gets perfectly taught later. Maybe there's something to be said for like, and I mean, the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra is not a sutra that has had a significant influence on Madhyamaka, but I was just thinking of it because it makes reference to this idea of like an initial way of teaching emptiness versus then like the later way of teaching emptiness.
Isn't that like a very canonical Yogacara?
It is, yeah. It's a Yogacara. It's a very important sutra for Yogacara, and it frames like how there's the way that the Buddha initially taught emptiness, which served to like cause a relinquishing of believing in the reality of things, and then a way that there's like later perfectly taught emptiness in the Sandhinamochana Sutra, which is to clarify some of the difficulties of the initial exposition of emptiness, I guess, is the way the Sandhinamochana Sutra frames its own discussion of emptiness. And maybe there's something to be said for that actually being a necessary feature of the exposition, that first you need to teach an emptiness that veers in a kind of nihilistic direction because people are not nihilistic enough with respect to their ordinary disposition. Like Gregor said, they're not nihilistic enough, but just by nature, they're too eternalist or unnihilist. But then you need to temper it a little bit to make sure that they don't end up just taking the philosophical view of annihilationism.
Right. Yeah, and I think key to this tactical strategy is not to establish or try to establish a counter view that still participates in fundamental ontology, except on a negative level, but more so kind of making sort of deconstructive negative analyses to undercut or undermine the sort of eternalist view. So it's sort of more so, it seems to like work on the eternalist view rather than producing an alternative. I guess I'm trying to see how we can like escape this problem of, you know, accidentally producing ourselves as annihilationists just because we're trying to oppose the opposite. So how do we do that tactically without falling into that trap? Something I'm concerned about. But yeah, I definitely, you know, align with that program. What is that? That's the guerrilla tactics of meddling middlers.
Right.
Okay, cool. So we're done with this chapter. So that's super cool. And I think this would be really helpful for the future chapters. So we're already at a usual end point, but if you guys don't mind, if we can continue, and I think I'll get this over real quick. Or if not, we can wait. No problem.
Yeah, maybe we should postpone it to next week, especially because next week we just want to do 17. I know it's a long chapter, but maybe, especially because this one's a short chapter, we could just do both.
We can do those too. Yeah, no problem. And I think next week we might have Aditya on too, so that would be good. Because I think 16 is also a really interesting and important chapter.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, thanks for coming, and thanks for everyone for listening. And I'll see you next time. All right. Bye.
Bye.